You can go, Sam. Thank you again, Sam, for being here with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much to all of you for making time out of your day. I know your time is valuable. Thanks for joining us. My name is Sam Farmer. I'm 52 years old. I faced a late autism spectrum diagnosis at the age of 40. Up until that point, I had grown up under the impression that all I was contending with was a learning disability. I had known that since around age 3 or 4. And as you can imagine, the autism diagnosis was quite a shocker. I didn't really see it coming. Just sort of came out of left field as the result of a neuropsychological evaluation. And all of a sudden, essentially a whole new world opened up to me. That would, I guess, be the optimistic view of things. But one thing led to another. As I learned more about what being autistic entails, as I processed what I had learned about myself, and as I started to figure out, how is it that I can work on greater happiness in life, perhaps in spite of the diagnosis, it dawned on me to start to write about this subject from the standpoint of sharing ideas and insights around how you can be happy and successful in life, despite the kinds of challenges and adversity that an autism spectrum diagnosis can bring. And in spite of all the adversity that I had faced throughout my life up to that point. And eventually, I started to blog for organizations in the autistic community. And the blog writing eventually led to the writing of my book, which is called A Long Walk Down a Winding Road: Small Steps, Challenges, and Triumphs Through an Autistic Lens. And I'll just quickly share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Just to talk a little bit briefly about the book before we delve into the topic at hand. A Long Walk Down a Winding Road is kind of a memoir and a self-help book rolled into one. If it had just been self-help, it would have been a pretty boring book because it wouldn't have had the memoir content to give the self-help content some context. Stories about how I learned what I did, stories from my life about what it can be to be autistic, and for the first 40 years of your life, not even know it. And so there are pretty good stories in there. Everybody likes a good story, plenty of that. And again, about how to discover greater happiness and success in life in the face of challenges and adversity, but also in the face of plenty of good things that I was very fortunate to have going for me in my life. My parents and who they were in particular, other things that I had going for myself, that certainly played a role in today, me being happy with myself, strong self-esteem, comfortable in my own skin, good, solid inner strength, that I credit my parents, my own efforts, all the things that I've been very fortunate to have that kind of play into why I'm happy and successful today. And the goal, really first and foremost, is for the book to be a self-help book, in that I'm hoping that the reader is able to use the ideas and insights I've gathered from my life experiences in order to carve out a better life for him or herself. Ideally, that's what any self-help book endeavors to be for its reader, and certainly mine is no exception. In the book, I deal primarily with strategies that I've learned around how to be successful in the workplace, developing social competence, rising above bullying, what I call marriaging or being a good spouse, and what I've learned from the now 21 years in my marriage and all I've learned from that. Parenting, both from the perspective of me as a son to my parents, as well as me being a father as well, from both of those perspectives. And perhaps most importantly, and this is certainly directly relevant to the topic at hand, is this notion of self-esteem building and how I learned how to love who I am. Building self-esteem, probably the most important aspect of the book above all. So on to the topic at hand. Why do we label autism a disability? Like many things in life, it's a mixed bag. There's no simple one-sided answer to this. There are reasons for it. There are reasons why this labeling is arguably an injustice. Not all, but to many of us on the spectrum. The reality is that there are a good number of people on the autism spectrum and those who are close to them, who work with them, who view it in this light. Autism is a spectrum. You have mild, moderate, and severe autism profiles in accordance with how acute or not acute the challenges are that are involved. And so in many ways, it's understandable to label autism a disability, particularly if you're further down the moderate to severe realm of the spectrum, where the challenges can be very acute and where admittedly, from what I've learned, from what I've seen, that life can be very challenging and very, very difficult as the severity of the challenges increases.
Sam?
Yes.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second. If you click the yellowish orange share button, your slides will be bigger to the audience.
The yellow.
Upper, I don't know if it's the upper right or the upper left for you.
All right. So would it be under more?
No, it's your slide presentation. It would be on the Google slide presentation. It should say share.
Oh, I see. Let's see.
Not next to the title, but the other side of the web page.
There it is.
There you go. Nope, sorry, that wasn't it. So let's go back. Where is it? Under slide. Yeah, somebody just said click slideshow. I can't. There we go.
There we go. Now it's bigger.
Now we're good to go. Thank you, whoever helped us out in the audience.
All right, very good, thanks. You learn something new every day. All right, so that's a big part of it. The other part of it is that we have this law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Stemming from the ADA is this notion that if one is to take advantage of what are often much needed supports, services, accommodations, that you need to have what would be designated as a disability under the ADA to be able to take advantage of these supports and services, accommodations. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for example, if you're in a school and you have what's called an IEP, an individualized education program, tailored to your specific needs, requirements, that would be one such service afforded to people on the autism spectrum, people with other disabilities that fall under the ADA. So it's in the labeling of autism and a bunch of other challenges as being a disability. That is what it takes, essentially, in order to get the support, both from private and public sources, that you may very well need. Without that diagnosis, those supports and services often become out of reach. And so that would be a very important reason why autism, particularly the more moderate to severe profiles, need to be labeled as a disability. A lot of it stems from the ADA and related bills that kind of came after. And then you have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, is documented in the DSM. The current version, the 5th edition, describing autism as being either moderate or severe. Those are the 3 designations. For me, where my challenges are relatively mild, that's where I would fall in terms of how the DSM describes autism. And where the DSM is the definitive diagnostic guide for autism spectrum disorders, in order to get supports and services, you would need that ASD diagnosis. And so it's kind of like a regrettable necessity for many of us who kind of view our autism profile as core to self-identity, as being a part of who we are. Many, including me, see in autism certain very unique abilities that some have referred to as superpowers, very unique abilities. For example, it's all but certain, had the diagnosis existed when he was alive, that Albert Einstein, for example, would have been diagnosed. It's got nothing to do with intelligence. Again, there are unique abilities around analytical capabilities, being able to focus on tasks for very long periods of time, the ability to hyper-focus, outside the box thinking, creativity, imagination, they all play into what many of us on the spectrum view as strengths rather than challenges. So no 2 people on the autism spectrum are alike in that regard. So again, the disability designation, yes, it's important, but with that downside for many of us who deal with the consequences of it being labeled as such. So why the disability label may be problematic? Yes, words matter. Disorder, disability, even the word diagnosis kind of implying that you've been diagnosed with something that many believe ought to be tried to be cured, or that have to be medically treated, etc. Where myself and many people who look at autism the way I do will feel, look, there's nothing about us that needs to be fixed or cured or treated like many believe a disability would need to be. That there's nothing wrong with us. What we have is just a natural alternative neurology, natural to have neurological diversity in the human population. It's just that it's stigmatized because we're different. Because in a society where inevitably social expectations, societal expectations are inevitably shaped by the majority, and the majority of people are, of course, non-autistic, that it can be easy, if you're in the minority, to have the stigma to deal with. And the challenge is can that stigma be risen above? It can be very difficult or impossible for many people I've met, sadly, to rise above the stigma. I'm very fortunate to have been able to. I grew up knowing I was different, but I was thankfully raised by parents who taught me that I'm smart, that I'm a good person, that I have a lot to be proud of. I was able to get the right help from clinicians, etc., that helped me with my self-esteem building efforts. I'm one of the very fortunate ones. Many of the people who I encounter in support groups are anything but fine. They suffer in many ways, from social isolation, from loneliness, from not wanting to deal with people because people are too critical of them, or people bully them, or they have to mask their true selves just to be able to try to fit into society, but having to mask who they are gets to be really, really exhausting and can lead to burnout, and which results in true happiness, true self-esteem eluding them, sadly. That words matter. And I've written many articles, the links to which are on my website, that speak to this point, that words matter, that words like condition, disability, disorder, it can be easy for those words to get under one's skin and compromise self-esteem, have a toxic impact on that. Autistic person with autism, you might think they mean one and the same, but in reality, to many of us on the spectrum, they are not. You have this notion of person first versus identity first language. I prefer the latter. I identify as an autistic person rather than a person with autism, because just by having the word with come between person and autism carries implications that kind of invite the interpretation of autism as being a condition or a disorder or a disability, where autistic person, that kind of language, thankfully, doesn't have that implication that I'm autistic, I'm unique, I'm different. but I'm a good person at heart. I'm smart. I work hard. I make my contributions to society, as many, many people with autism do. They are not one and the same, even though many might think they are, but they're not. Words matter. So what can be done? What can be done going forward, particularly if you are an autistic individual who is working towards building self-esteem, who's working towards rising above the stigma, who wants to be accepted for who he or she is? It's all on how you look at things. I agreed a while back with my wife to do many of the more thankless household chores in our house. I agreed to do that. I said, fine. Many would ask, well, Sam, why would you do that? There's no fun involved in scrubbing toilets or sinks or showers or doing the laundry, hanging it once it's done in the washing machine, etc. And yet, the way I look at that is that I look at two advantages rather than the downside that I just described. I look at the household chores as, number one, being a reason for me to get off the couch and not be sedentary, which I know is good for my health. And number two, most importantly, to be helpful to my wife. You can look at it either way. It's all on how we look at things. Autism can be looked at according to the medical model, or it can be looked at from the social model. The social model being the outlook that I have, where this is not a medical condition. It's integral to self-identity. It's a natural, albeit in the minority, component of the natural neurological diversity in society, versus looking at it as a medical issue, as something to be aware of, but something not to be accepted. Autism awareness and autism acceptance being two very different things. How do we choose to look at it? For most things, there's going to be an upside and there's going to be a downside. What would you choose? And so I see it as a personality attribute rather than as a disability. The optimist in me tells me that it's important for me to look at it from the former perspective. If anything, with respect to my self-esteem, to my sense of self, which is something that for a very long time, as I describe in the book, I had to work on very hard. A lot of hard work when you know you're different in some fundamental ways to build the self-esteem, but I succeeded at it. And if I'm able to succeed at it, I know that others can, but maybe they need some ideas and insights on how to get there, which is why I wrote the book, which is why I continue to write articles for media outlets, etc., give presentations like these, is to try to give back, to try to help others the way I was helped. Using your inner defenses to stop the stigma and these potentially harmful words from getting under your skin. Use your inner strength. The stronger you're able to build up your self-esteem, I would argue from my own experience, the stronger your sense of inner strength becomes. The two often go hand in hand, self-esteem and inner strength. Optimism over pessimism, positivity over negativity. Again, that plays in to how we look at these things one way or another. Celebrating differences. Autism is but one profile, as I call it, not condition, but profile, that plays into neurodiversity. You may have heard that word. I consider myself to be a neurodiversity self-advocate. Why self-advocate? Because I am neurodiverse myself, and so I'm advocating for the segment of the population to which I belong. Neurodiversity celebrates neurological difference. Studies have shown that in one form or another, some 1 in 5 of us are neurodiverse. It's not just autism, it's ADHD, it's the gamut of learning disorders, learning disabilities, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, to name a few, all play into the neurodiversity equation. I would argue, again, with the disability label, that can be problematic, but I say it anyway, because that's often how it's referred to when people talk about these things. But ideally, we would learn to celebrate our differences rather than to use them as a basis for discrimination or injustice or stigma. The DSM-5 is like I said earlier, it's a valuable diagnostic resource that clinicians everywhere use to diagnose ASD and other psychological, psychiatric disorders as society defines them to be. But no document, no diagnostic manual can tell me or anybody else how we must look at ourselves. We look at ourselves in whatever light we want. It's our choice. The DSM-5 is obviously a very prominent, very influential document in society that often it can be taken out of context and used as a basis of telling people how they need to look at themselves, but I don't buy it, not for a minute. Many, many of us on the autism spectrum agree. No book, no manual can tell us how we must look at ourselves. Support groups, very helpful. I've been participating in these for a number of years, both for my own good, as well as with the hope that if I'm in a support group, that I might be able to say things that could help others in the group. In a support group, you can be who you are, typically, without consequence. You can open up about your autism profile or whatever you might be struggling with. Doesn't have to be autism. You've got support groups of any number of types, depending upon what challenges you face. That it's a way to find community. It's an environment in which you can be who you are and open up about who you are without consequence, where you don't have to worry about society expectations, you don't have to worry about stigma. you can find community and get support in that regard. That is always helpful. And of course, no matter what, to accept who you are and be who you are at all costs. Much easier said than done, particularly for autistic people who perceive that if they are who they are, then there are consequences to that. I've come to know people in the community who were being themselves and who got laid off from a job, or upon revealing their diagnosis, lost all their friends, or have gone through any number of trials for being who they are. And then I speak to other people in the community who tell me, well, I have to mask who I am when I'm in front of most people, but when I'm with my close group of friends, they understand me, they know me. I can be who I am with my friends, or I can be who I am with my spouse, where I can't necessarily do that without consequence around other people, which raises the point that who we choose to surround ourselves with can make us or break us. Very important who we choose to associate with in terms of being able to rise above the stigma and rise above this notion of autism being the disability or the disorder labeling that leads to the stigma that I would argue is wrong and unjust, but it is what it is. Obviously, a lot that's wrong in the world, but other things in the world that are good. Among them, support groups, finding the right community, finding the right people to associate with, plenty of good people in the world. Ideally, we would take care in choosing the right people to be around. And that's really pretty much it in a nutshell. The disability labeling is necessary because of the need by many on the autism spectrum for supports and accommodations, both from public and private institutions. But on the flip side, it can do great harm. Like many things, it's a mixed bag. samfarmerauthor.com, particularly on the media page, there are links to numerous articles that I've written, some of which are relevant to this topic. There are links to podcasts, coaching videos, information about my book, book reviews, a way to order my book. There are buttons there that lead to my Amazon author page. Should any of you want to order the book who don't already have it. And at samfarmerauthor.com, there's a contact page as well, that if you or others who you tell about my website were to want to reach out to me for any reason, I always get back to whoever reaches out to me on my website. I don't always reply immediately, but I do as soon as I'm able to. And another great reference for those on the spectrum who could benefit from support groups, there's the Asperger Autism Network, www.aane.org. Can go to their website, you can sign up for their newsletters. Upon looking at the newsletter, you would very quickly become overwhelmed of how many support groups there are for men, for women, exclusive to one or the other, or a mix of both, people on the spectrum with differing gender identities, different age groups, different sexual orientations, support groups for parents, for grandparents, for siblings, for friends of people on the autism spectrum, all kinds of support groups, some in person, most virtual. It's a wonderful organization for those kinds of resources. And they host conferences, some of which I've had the privilege to present in. And then there are other like organizations across the country, too many of them to keep track of. But AANE is the big one. I've been a member of this community for a number of years now, so that's the one I'm inclined to recommend. But plenty of others. And that's pretty much the gist of it.